How's it going, folks? So now that the dust has settled a bit since the financials, I've kind of fully transitioned into this new NintenDeen Today format where I show myself on camera periodically. Mind you, I'm not going to be showing my face in this one because it's a lot of numbers talk and I just don't feel like turning the camera on. And I made an entire video about the one significant thing that I got wrong in the entirety of 2025, which I really only made because I was told that I would never admit if I was wrong about anything. And while I do hate being wrong, if there's one thing that I appreciate and it cancels out my hatred for being wrong is being able to prove others wrong. So once again, I was right in that I'm willing to admit when I'm wrong. But that's besides the point. Honestly, I made that video because I wanted to get the total shipped through sales numbers out of the way, because I knew that would absorb a lot of the attention from this channel, and then now that they've all kind of moved on for a bit, and I've gotten a bit of a chance to review the financials, I can get into the nitty-gritty about the financials because there is a lot that we were absolutely right about over the past year. In fact, we were significantly more right than we were wrong. I say we not only as myself, but all of you out there, the Nintendo fans that felt that the Nintendo Switch 2, and really Nintendo in general, was overstepping with their greed with too much confidence, making the incorrect assumption that people will buy whatever it is that they put out without any thought. I don't plan on making this a single video like I did after the February financials where it was like an hour and 20 minutes long. Rather, I'm going to pick some of the best talking points and use those to make videos to analyze it. And I'm going to try to keep it as relevant as possible. Starting with today, we're going to be looking at it at the big picture. The 17.37 Switch 2s that were shipped out to the world, with 15 million of those actually sold to customers. And an added benefit of having this discussion is we get to understand why investors were disappointed with the most recent financial reports by Nintendo, and why the president of Nintendo himself admitted that this fastest selling console still failed to meet expectations. And I'm going to mention my sources up front. You can find them in the description as well. I'll share some screenshots as I go through this, but I want to make it as crystal clear as possible that I am not making up numbers. My data is all being taken from the Nintendo IR page on Nintendo's website, from their 2018 financials that were uploaded on January 31st through the first week of February, which included all of the data for the Nintendo Switch 1 in 2017 leading up to December 31st of that year, as well as the Nintendo financial report for the PDFs that were uploaded this year, earlier this month in February, that include all of the sales data up until the end of 2025. In addition to that, I've taken some numbers from various sales tracking websites, specifically Famitsu numbers from Japan, Circana numbers from the USA, and various different locations for Europe based off of headlines that were shared in specific articles. I will be sharing some screenshots of tables that were made by people on random forums, whether it's Resetera or Installbase, and these tables deliver the information that was provided either by Circana or Famitsu and the like. So to be clear, the numbers do not belong to those that made the tables, they belong to the original source, which in this case is Famitsu or Circana. So none of these numbers are mine, none of them are my own assumptions. If there is a number that I state is my own assumption, I will share that as I discuss. Everything is completely an analysis of numbers that were provided, either by Nintendo, Famitsu, or Circana for the most part. So since this exercise is for the most part going to be comparing the Switch 2's first year to the Switch 1's first year, let's start off by looking at the 2018 financials. I made this table so that it's easier to follow along, but the numbers come from these screenshots that I will be providing on the screen now. In 2017, according to the Nintendo financial report, in Japan, the number of Switch 1s that were shipped, which is the sell-in number, was 3.72 million. In the Americas, it was 5.94 million, and back in 2018, Europe and other were one category, it was totaled 5.2 million. This brings the total of Nintendo Switch 1s that were actually shipped out to the masses at 14.86 million. According to Famitsu, by the end of 2017, 3.41 million of those Switch 1s were sold in Japan, and according to Circana, 4.88 million were sold in the US from the Americas. Those are the two largest and easiest accessible pieces of data, and they're also kind of the most relevant for this discussion. Now, in that same financial report, there's a section where Nintendo talks about sell-through numbers. They mentioned that by that point in time, there are 8 at least 1 million game sellers on the Switch 1, which is a stark contrast in comparison to the few that we have on the Switch 2. And not only that, at least 4 of those 8 million million sellers outsold the best-selling non-bundled game on the Switch 2, which is Donkey Kong Bonanza. In fact, the sell-through number for these titles is higher than the actual shipped number for Bonanza, because we don't actually know how many copies of Donkey Kong Bonanza were sold through. We only know what was shipped, which is sell-in. This is part of the reason why the Switch 2 software sales are a massive concern. You can see how much of a drop-off there's been. In addition to all of that information, at the very bottom, you find out that hardware sales 12.13 million Switch 1s were sold in 2017. So the console shipped 14.86 and it sold through 12.13 million. And it's with very little doubt that a vast majority of that gap falls into the Europe/other category. Because if you assume that the US makes up roughly 85% of total sales of the Americas, and I think that's a generous percentage, the US market could very well make up more than that, that would mean the difference of what was shipped versus what was sold between Japan and the Americas was about 500,000. And that's like an absolute maximum. Because in Japan, that 3.41 number doesn't even include the My Nintendo store, which makes up at least a couple 100,000 probably. But still, we can say 500,000 is in the lagging from the US and Japan, or rather the Americas and Japan, which would imply that over 2 million of those extra units were lost in that Europe/other category. And by lost, I mean by the end of 2017, they were still sitting on shelves waiting to be sold, which checks out with the slow start of the life that the Switch 1 had in Europe. Now, in comparison, we have the February 2026 financials. The sell-in numbers for the Switch 2 in Japan were 4.78 million shipped. In the Americas, it was 5.98 million shipped. In Europe, it was 4.1 million, and in other, it was 2.5 million. Over here, they broke up the Europe and the other category, probably because they figured Europe will be doing a lot better in this generation than in the previous one, so they kind of wanted to give it its own category now so it doesn't look like it's completely lagging behind PlayStation. But if you combine the two of them, it's 6.6 million for Europe/other, which comes out to a total of 17.37 million. Now here's where it gets a little bit interesting, and this is actually why I completely undershot the amount of consoles that were sold worldwide. The Famitsu numbers as of the end of 2025 suggest that the Switch 2 had only sold through to customers 3.78 million units in Japan. Now, we all know that the Nintendo Switch 2 until now is still somewhat supply constrained in Japan, and it's moving very quickly, very healthily. And we also know that My Nintendo store has been shipping out a lot of Switch 2 units. The number that I assumed that we would see for the shipped Japanese consoles was 4 million. I didn't expect it to be as high as 4.78 million. So I figured if US and Japan made up 60 to 65% of the consoles, then the total sell-through of the console would have fallen anywhere between 13 to 13.5 million in my assumptions. But what I didn't account for was a 1 million difference between the Famitsu number and the actual Japanese number. If I had bumped up the Japanese number in my assessment to be 4.5 million instead of 4 million, then I would have added the US number plus the Japanese number and divided it by 0.6, and that would have given me almost exactly 15 million units sold. So my calculation was correct, my assumptions were correct, but the number that I was using for Japan was incorrect. And this is actually, for me at least, one of the best ways to be incorrect, because this further proves my point that I've been arguing since the very beginning, that the Nintendo Switch 2 is largely being carried by Japanese numbers. In fact, the better that the Nintendo Switch 2 does in Japan, the more it proves me right, and even the more it upsets investors, because the Japanese Switch 2 is not worth as much as the Western ones. But we'll get to that later. So in the Americas, they shipped out more consoles than they did last time by 40,000, but with that higher shipment, they sold 400,000 fewer units. I should say 400,000 fewer units in the USA alone. Again, this is a very big part of the reason why the Switch 2 performed below expectations in the US, and part of the reason investors were upset. When you look at the Japanese comparisons to 2017, you see a 30% increase. You see the growth. When you look at the US, what you see is no growth. It's almost the exact same number as it was last time, and they expect more. And likewise with Europe and other. It was at 5.2 million before, and now it's at 6.6 million. And of course, this is all reflected in the revenue and the profits and the lack of increase in the forecast and the low software sales and all of that stuff. When you translate all of these sales and the dollar value gets spit out, that final number that approaches them is what scares them away. So when you look at it from the grand scheme of things, right, the shipped numbers matter more than the sold numbers. The total shipped Switch 2 units is 2.51 million more than what was shipped for the Switch 1 in 2017. 42% of that difference was Japan. See, that's the growth that you would expect. 55% of that was made up in the Europe/other category. So basically, breaking it down, roughly half of those additional sales were in Japan, and roughly half of those additional sales were in new markets that Nintendo has really not broken into yet. And there's very little data to suggest how well or how poorly the console is doing in those new markets. And the reason we can make those kinds of conclusions is because we know in the Americas, the difference was negligible for the most part. They shipped slightly more and sold a little bit more less. And we know in Europe, the sales for the Switch 2 have kind of fairly lined up with the Switch 1 in 2017. 2025 for the Switch 2 was either slightly more or slightly less depending on the country for the total of 2025 versus the total of 2017. So all that leaves is the 42% gap we see in Japan, and the rest must be made up through other. And ultimately, that's what has made it such a big difference in shipments that were sold through in their respective first years. This is why so many people in Western markets are surprised the Switch 2 is still performing well despite it feeling like an inferior console. Because the reality is, if you're sitting in America, it's actually not doing as well as the Switch 1 did in its first year. And when the Switch 1 launched, it was kind of ignored by most people in the gaming community, whereas when the Switch 2 launched, there were a lot more people that had eyes on it, had interest on it, and have instead decided to turn away. Likewise with Europe. But it still has an amazing opening 7 months, in part because it's the only console to get its first holiday season in that first 7 months, or rather its first holiday season with no supply constraints. And also, a very big reason why it's getting that fastest selling title is because a significant proportion of those sales is being made up in the increase of popularity that Nintendo has had in Japan, which we are very disconnected from in the West, as well as random obscure markets worldwide that the Switch 2 is probably not going to have a long-lasting stay in because they are Sony lands. Because if you look at it from the US specifically, one thing is for certain is that in the US, where the Switch 2 was expected to outperform the Switch 1, it completely failed to do that. And it failed while having significantly more favor and momentum than the Switch 1 did coming off of the Wii U. It didn't require people to be convinced to join in the same way the Switch 1 did. The Switch 1 was severely supply constrained until Mario Odyssey's launch in October, which means it easily could have outpaced the Switch 2 prior to the holidays if it didn't have those issues. The Nintendo Switch 2's only impressive feat until now is that it had a lot of units available at launch, and it has yet to do anything impressive since. Momentum has continued to trend downwards, and it's not just a matter of holiday sales being pulled forward. October was the launch of a Pokemon month, and it was one of, if not the slowest months for hardware sales for Nintendo consoles when a new Pokemon game is launched. Normally when a Pokemon game is launched, there are more sales in that specific month for the hardware. November and December were both around 35 to 40% lower than what the Switch 1 managed in 2017, which, need I remind you, 2017 was one of the slower holidays for the Switch 1 prior to 2024. In a week from now, we'll know if this massive drop-off continued on in January when we get the next Circana numbers. As far as Europe is concerned, the Switch 1 did very well in Europe by the end of its life cycle, but it had a much slower start in comparison to the States and Japan. I have videos that break down each of the major European markets individually, but basically the Switch 1 in 2017 did not impress all that much in the largest European markets. The success came as time went on and momentum started to build. There were a lot more people convinced about Nintendo being good prior to the launch of the Switch 2 than there were for the Switch 1. Just based on the Switch 1's massive success in Europe. The gap in Europe for customer sentiment at the end of the Wii U versus the end of the Switch 1 was even larger than in the States. Like in Europe, the Switch 2 outsold the Wii U basically in its opening couple of weeks. But in the States, the Switch 2 has yet to surpass the Wii U sales, although it will in a few months' time. But the point that I'm trying to make is clearing the Switch 1 should have been a very low bar in Europe for the Switch 2. Even easier than in the States, but still, at best, it basically just about tied, either slightly ahead or slightly behind. Meanwhile, in Japan, the Switch 2 is flourishing. Until now, in Japan, in order to buy a Switch 2 directly from Nintendo, you have to meet a specific threshold criteria in order to buy it, and even then it's at a first-come, first-served basis. It sold just under 30% more in 2025 than what the Switch 1 did in 2017. That's a huge jump up, and I expect that the other markets were supposed to do the same thing. There's a lot of talk about what Nintendo expected and whether or not the Switch 2 has met expectations. I think Japan is a clear indicator of what was expected of the Switch 2 by Nintendo and especially by Nintendo's investors. In Japan, the numbers didn't fall off after the console launched like they did everywhere else because of a lack of demand. it was strictly because of a lack of supply. The holiday season in Japan wasn't a disappointment like it was everywhere else. They shipped out an additional 30-ish% consoles, and they've just about sold through that entire thing. And even now, the console is still not completely readily available, which is what most people would have expected to be the case with the Switch 2 as well in Western markets. The Mario Kart World bundles actually mostly sold out just as planned. There were more Pokemon Legends bundles that were provided, and it was meant to be worldwide, but in Western markets, they seemingly didn't order more Pokemon bundles because of how many extra Mario Kart World bundles were still in circulation. In my opinion, Japan is a template to what many would have expected worldwide, and obviously this is the case because it's the only region where the Switch 2 was priced with the consideration of the local economy. Western markets are subsidizing the Switch 2 for the Japanese market, so they have priced it competitively over there in comparison to everywhere else in the world. And as such, the trajectory of the Switch 2's console launch is moving exactly in Japan as many would have expected it to move everywhere else in the world. It gets onto the shelves and it moves off the shelves immediately. Japan is outpacing the USA for console sales, even though in Japan the console was severely supply constrained, and in the US it was not supply constrained at all. The last time this happened for Nintendo was with the 3DS in its first year, and the 3DS had the lowest number of sales out of any handheld Nintendo console in history, and it did so with a whole bunch of price drops from Nintendo. So the Switch 2 might very likely have to do the same thing in order to achieve similar numbers to the 3DS, at least in the West. Now, one final thing worth pointing out is this graph over here for the sell-through data that Nintendo shared in their recent financial report. I'm seeing some tables going around where people have estimated by pixel counting the exact number of Switch 2s that were sold based off of what this picture shared. But I do think the numbers on those charts are inflated by just a little bit. Not that it really matters that much, but if I'm looking at this graph that Nintendo's sharing, and I know that the first number they gave us was 3.5 million and the final number they gave us was 15 million, I would set those values as the constants that we know. And this is probably more information than necessary, but if you're pixel counting, depending on whether you choose the top of the line or the bottom of the line to be the actual reference point of what the graph is suggesting, it makes a little bit of a difference for what the number is actually at, because the line is pretty thick and the pixels are pretty small. Also, it's not meant to be that specific and that accurate. These are based off of internal estimates, so that's why they say 3.5 million and 15 million, and they don't give you like a whole bunch of decimal points after it. I know it seems like this is kind of a negligible difference, but it holds some value based off of some discussions that I had in the past. So, for example, if you're using the top of the line versus the bottom of the line for the end of June, the Switch 2 either surpassed 5 million by the end of June, or it was just under 5 million by the end of June. Right, my assumption was that the sold-through number was closer to like 4.9 million by the end of June, and my opinion was that the reason Nintendo didn't announce they sold 5 million in the first month was because they hadn't. Instead, they waited until the 7th week to say they sold 6 million. And likewise, my assumption was that closer to the end of October is when the console actually surpassed 10 million. And depending on which part you're anchoring at, that could either be week 19, which would put us around October 20th, or 2 weeks after that at week 21, which would put us around November 2nd. And on that same note, if you back up a few weeks to the end of September when the console had shipped out 10.36 million units, my argument was that the sold-through number was sitting around 7.5 to 8 million units. And once again, depending on which part of that line you use as the anchor point and you assume that's the reference for what Nintendo was counting, either I was wrong by 500,000 and I should have said 8 to 8.5 million instead of 7.5 to 8 million, or it looks like it might be just beyond 9 million if you're using the top of the line as the actual data. But there are two reasons why I believe it's the bottom of the line. First off, the bottom of the line matches almost exactly with 3.5 million in week 1, and likewise the bottom of the line matches up almost exactly with 15 million units at the end of the chart, which are the two numbers that we know are absolute and given to us by Nintendo, so why would they not use those numbers for the line that they're drawing? The other reason is, well, this is a corporate presentation. They're going to try to make it as good as possible. When you present these things to investors, you're not going to make the line lower and be like, yeah, use the top point as the anchor point. You're going to make the line higher and use the bottom point as the anchor point because for the eyes, it looks like there's a much larger gap in the sell-through rate from the Switch 2 versus the Switch 1. Even though there is already a gap, but every little bit counts for these presentations. So it seems like just logically, the bottom of the line would be the sell-through numbers that Nintendo has, But ultimately, this is not that big of a talking point, since we already have the numbers for 2017 and 2025. That whole discussion is me just being a stickler and going into probably more detail than needed to analyze this. But obviously, that's kind of what I do around here. Also, you know, it provides confirmation bias, so that's always fun. Either way, I'm willing to be challenged on that. I won't die on this hill. I don't really care that much if it's the bottom of the line or the top of the line, and I was wrong about a few weeks based off of my estimates earlier. I think the general theme and the general conclusions of everything that I've been discussing since before the Switch 2 has launched so far has been fairly in line with my estimates. I've been wrong about a few things, but mostly right, and most of the stuff that I was saying from prior to the console even launching has kind of shown to be true. Third-party percentages are much lower than people had thought they would be. Software sales are much lower than what people thought they would be. The Switch 2 did not meet expectation in Western markets. The Switch 2's demand was satiated fairly early on, and that's a reason why the holiday sales numbers were as low as they were. The Switch 2 did not have a system seller, especially in Western markets. Nearly 1/3 of the entirety of the Switch 2's user base is coming from Japan, where the console is cheaper. I could go on, and I am going to go on in further videos, but I think that's a very good stopping point for now. I am very comfortable with my assessment of 2025. I may have been wrong in some aspects, but I was more right than most people were, including all of the Switch 2 fans that have dramatically shifted the goalposts from the very beginning until now. They are landing on my numbers with my conclusions and pretending that they knew it was happening all along. They all expected better. They all expected that in Western markets the Switch 2 would have a November higher than 700,000. I was the only one that predicted it would be around 500,000 in the USA. I was the only one that suggested that the console would face discounts. Nobody expected that. That ended up coming true. Even prior to that, I was the only one that said that you would be able to find a Switch 2 in stores fairly easily, and people were able to find it within a month and a half from launch in the States and even earlier in Europe. And most importantly, I was the only one to say that the discounts all around the world that the Switch 2 have seen were a very clear sign of Western markets slowing down, and the demand in those markets not matching the initial price point. At launch, everybody said you need to buy the Nintendo Switch 2 now because it's going to be more expensive later. If you listened to me, it would have been cheaper for you by the end of the year. I don't know what this means for 2026 yet. Quite frankly, I'm not sure if Nintendo has any interest in dropping the price of their console. But what I do know is that the demand has dramatically slowed down for the Nintendo Switch 2. The momentum has completely slipped away. Even in some of the earliest numbers that we're seeing from Europe, we are finding data that the Switch 2 is selling fewer units now than what the Switch 1 managed last year. But hey, they'll tell you that's just Spain. But as we saw through all of 2025, everything that was reflected in the markets that we first see the numbers, which is always Spain, ends up being a somewhat consistent reflection everywhere else. And I don't see why this is going to be any different. Regardless, I will continue to follow this along. As per usual, thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you on the next one.